How does a slave become a slave? Generally, if you ask people, they'll tell you that there's a villain involved. Someone who came and took an innocent person and enslaved them. And in fact, if you take a look at the book of Exodus, many commentaries will have a very similar opinion of Pharaoh. Pharaoh is the villain. He's someone who has no sensitivity whatsoever. He is greedy. He's even bloodthirsty. It's very easy to paint the villain as the one responsible for slavery. And in fact, if you look at the very beginning of the book of Exodus, there's a discussion of how Pharaoh begins to enslave the Jewish people. So he turns to the Egyptians and he says, look, we have to outsmart these Jews. They're too dangerous. There's too many of them. Now, after he has this conversation, we don't know precisely what the results of the conversation are. We know that he begins to enslave the Jews, but there's no specific plan that's articulated. And so all of the commentaries try to fill in the hole. What is it that Pharaoh and the people decided? So one commentary, the Ramban, suggests that Pharaoh, together with his advisors, have decided to exterminate the Jewish people. They want to kill them out. Now, Pharaoh is not quite that bold, not quite willing to go out and actually exterminate the Jews directly. So he suggests that maybe slavery, awful slavery, will eventually destroy the Jews because simply the conditions of slavery will kill them out one by one. And that's one theory of what Pharaoh was interested in doing. Another theory of what Pharaoh was interested in doing was actually he always wanted to enslave the Jews. That even when he's talking about the threat that the Jews cause for the Egyptian people, at the very same time Pharaoh's thinking to himself, well, if I enslave them, I can get some free slaves, and at the same time keep the Jews under control, and they will no longer be a threat. And these two explanations work very well for us. Pharaoh is a villain. We like to keep our villains very simple. We like to think of ourselves as saying it's all the villain's fault. But there's a third commentary that comes along that says something very different, that really changes the equation. Sforno comes along and says, you know what Pharaoh's plan was? Pharaoh actually wanted to get all of the Jews to leave Egypt. He wanted to scare them off. So Pharaoh figured that the best way to scare them off would be to put them into public work, make their lives miserable. They have to come in every day and slave. And Pharaoh figured if they end up becoming slaves for a long enough time, they'll just run away from the country. Now, according to Sforno's understanding of this particular story, what ends up happening is that Pharaoh comes, makes the Jews into slaves, and the Jews refuse to run away. Pharaoh was hoping they would run away, but they didn't. So Sforno says, once Pharaoh sees that the Jews are willing slaves, Pharaoh says to himself, if these people are stupid enough to be slaves, they'll be my slaves. Now, Sforno's commentary is a bit of a slap in the face, and in particular it seems very politically incorrect. If you sort of grasp the dimensions of what he's saying, essentially what he's saying is that he's blaming the victim. We generally blame the villain. We say it's the slave master whose fault it is for slavery. Here Sforno is doing something that's not politically correct and is actually quite bold. He is blaming the victim. Now, we understand that blaming the victim can be wrong for multiple reasons. It's first of all incredibly insensitive. Of course, it's politically incorrect, but that's not necessarily always a very important consideration. But also very often, blaming the victim is simply factually wrong. But even though Sforno is blaming the victim, and we're not necessarily always that comfortable with it, there's a certain wisdom to what he has to say. And let me just give you a little bit of a background to this. If you go to the 12th century, or you go even earlier, and you ask a theologian, why does a bad thing happen to someone? Generally, the answer is, it's because it's his fault. If someone's a victim, it's their fault. Blaming the victim was very common in the Middle Ages, certainly on a theological level. What the Sforno is doing is he's doing this actually on a historical level. Blaming the victim was common many years ago. What we've done today is we've swung to the other side of the pendulum. We never blame the victim. We never hold the victim to account. We never hold the victim responsible for anything. And that perhaps is going a little bit too far as well. Not that the victim is always guilty. Certainly they're not. Not that they're even guilty a large percentage of the time. Certainly not. But it doesn't mean that the victims too have to give an account for what they've done. George Jonas wrote a fascinating article in the National Post last week in which he discussed his experiences in becoming a pilot, in training to be a pilot. And he said one of the interesting things about being a pilot is that you always have to examine your own actions before you place blame on others. And he talks about one time that he was going out training to be a pilot, and then an aircraft came right in front of them. And he turns to his instructor and he says, "What's wrong with those guys?" So the instructor looked at him and said, "First, let's see if there's anything wrong with us. Did we make a mistake? Those guys are here today, gone tomorrow, but our mistakes ride in the cockpit with us all the time." And that's, I think, what the Sforno is teaching us. We never want to blame the victim. That's certainly true. It's insensitive, and very often it's untrue. But it doesn't mean, in particular when we're victims, that we shouldn't carefully examine what we've done. Even victims can make mistakes. Even the Jews might have tripped into slavery in Egypt. And if we think that way, if we think like pilots, then we will end up correcting our own mistakes before we worry about the mistakes of others.